There's a lot of things that are very personal to me in this lecture here tonight. You know, even Community Natural Foods is a pillar of your community. Back 25 years ago, they're having their 25th anniversary, I think. I was a starving university student, and in order so that I could eat good, wholesome food, I put in 10 hours a week at the Natural Foods Co-op on 11th Avenue above the Keg and Cleaver. Well, Peter and Gary, the two brothers that started Community Natural Foods, drove taxi to pay the overhead for at least 2 years because it was a vision and a dream they had, and it didn't make any money for a long time. They worked real hard. And a lot of people chipped in to make that a reality. I worked side by side with Terry Willard. You might know Terry. He was a starving university student as well back then. And to see what they're doing now, the thriving business that they have and what they're contributing to the community is a great thing. And my education was in Calgary. My upbringing was in Calgary. My mom and dad are here. And this is really my hometown. So a lot warms my heart about being here. And even this room, I used to come to a computer nerd club here called the Amiga Users Group of Calgary. There was more pocket protectors per seat than any other single place on the planet, I think, here. Band-Aids holding glasses together. But nevertheless, the other thing that is very close to my heart is this topic, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's not really the area that I first began to pursue as a medical doctor. I was really in Calgary as a sports medicine physician. I was one of your Olympic team physicians for 4 years with the Canada bobsleigh team, and didn't really have any thoughts about this condition until my son was diagnosed with this several years ago, and we were faced with a dilemma that probably several of you are facing right now, or maybe have already faced, and that is the school starts sending reports home about your son's behavior, and your son becomes increasingly unhappy, feels like he's not fitting in, the kids don't like him anymore, he's not able to do things in school, he starts saying very negative things about himself, his self-image goes down, 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 and the answer that you're given is to take him to a doctor and get him put on medication. And I was very reluctant to do that, and I decided at that point, I was heading up a research institute on Vancouver Island, I decided to seek grant support to do research and looking at the causes of attention deficit disorder beyond what had been looked at up till this point. There's been a almost total focus on the cause in terms of finding a fancy new drug to treat it. You know, what kind of neurotransmitters are responsible for this, and how can we manipulate those with another medication that we can patent for a little bit longer than the medications we have now, or what type of gene is responsible so that somehow we can eventually do some sort of genetic manipulation on this. But the research in terms of environmental factors contributing to this, or God forbid, nutritional factors or gastrointestinal factors have not even been hardly thought of, or had been outrightly dismissed many years ago when maybe some incomplete research had been done and not really shown much success. So I began you could say, a quest to find answers, initially for my son, but as I started to see him improve and essentially emerge as a normal boy from a boy we were told had a disability, I started to see the same thing in some of my research participants, and then later in the patients that I began to work with. And over the last few years, it's become a very rewarding thing on a regular basis to have a family come back in with their child after several weeks or months working with them, and coming back with glowing reports about the progress that's being made. And most of the time it does not involve medication. I'm not a fanatic. I don't throw the whole idea of medication out, but I believe that attention deficit disorder should be treated like a lot of other conditions that doctors treat. For instance, if you have high cholesterol, what are doctors supposed to do? We're admonished in every textbook, every authority. We're told that if you diagnose high cholesterol in a patient, you should work with that patient through nutritional counseling and dietary advice and lifestyle counseling for several months, most say 6 months, before you even consider medication. The same with diabetes. When I have an adult onset diabetic come to my office, the goal is to transform the thinking of that individual, to make them realize that there's something over their shoulder here, that if they don't listen to it, they're going to end up in an early grave, or they're going to end up with a leg amputation or blindness. But instead, within a couple of years, most of my diabetic patients aren't diabetic anymore. We can virtually reverse the condition without resorting to medication in most cases. And that's really not that revolutionary an idea. If you look at the scientific literature, that's considered normal. But with attention deficit disorder, the focus is make the diagnosis carefully and then prescribe the treatment. And most of the time, the treatment means just a prescription. It isn't any combination of treatments, it's a medication. And that's really what I'm trying to change and try to raise awareness about, is that in fact, there are things that we can find underlying this that are causes of this. We could deal with this from more of a cause-oriented approach without having to jump quickly to using medication. We were told by the Surgeon General a couple of years ago that right now 10% of North American children have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Now that's as many kids as have left-handedness. That's kids that will, most of them eventually be on a medication and who will probably most likely not grow out of that condition given the approach that's taken to psychiatric disorders. And in fact, as kids get older and they reach adolescence and so on, you'll see more enter this club of psychiatric illness. And attention deficit disorder is certainly one of those. And that's to me a very disturbing fact, because I don't think it was always that way. I don't think that many kids used to have psychiatric disorders, but they do now. And the incidence may be rising quite dramatically. Another disturbing fact, it isn't just children. We know that Alzheimer's disease and other disorders of brain aging, they are scheduled to overtake heart disease as the leading cause of death and disability in this decade. So soon, the idea that heart disease is how most of us will die will be a thing of the past as we start to see more and more people developing neurodegenerative diseases of the aging process as well. And what we're seeing is that we've gone from what we used to call Generation X really to Generation RX in one generation. We're seeing an unprecedented number of kids and adults on neuropsychiatric medications all around the world. I was in Taiwan a couple years ago. As many as 15 to 20% of boys, they estimate in Taipei right now, have attention deficit disorder. Many of them are now on Ritalin, in a country where genetically it doesn't seem like there's such a thing as attention deficit disorder. And then in Australia, I've been there several times talking to physicians about this, and in southern Australia, they told me that there was a 1,000% increase in the prescriptions for Ritalin over the last decade. 1,000%, tenfold increase. Phenomenal. And it's not that it's a new drug, it's been around for 40 years. And we can't just classify this as some sort of fad diagnosis, the diagnosis of, of today and it'll be gone tomorrow. The fact is that prognostically, the future of these kids that get diagnosed with this is not that great. About 50% will end their lives catastrophically or will live their life in despair. And I work a lot with adults. I kind of work at two ends of the spectrum. I work with kids with ADHD, where the parents bring them in and the parents are motivated and the kids are quite malleable and you can work with them. And then I don't often see that many adolescents because they just kind of dig in their heels and say, forget that, I'm not going to do any of this stuff. And then I see them again. Unfortunately, I see people in a residential drug treatment center on Vancouver Island. And in the time that I've been working there, helping out, I would estimate 1 in 3 of those individuals at that drug treatment center, which probably is fairly representative of other drug treatment centers, about 1 in 3, their primary issue in their life is attention deficit disorder. And if they don't get some help for that, they will go back to using again, invariably, because that will end up putting them back into a state of despair, in a state where they feel like their life isn't worth worrying about, and they'll end up going back to using drugs as an escape. In the previous book that I wrote, if any of you want a book that's thicker and is full of references, this is the one that will give you more to chew on, because it's a book that has about 750 references, and it goes into a lot more depth about both all of the various causes that contribute to this condition, as well as a variety of treatments besides just nutritional. The new book is focusing just on the essential elements of nutritional change and how that applies to conditions like attention deficit disorder. And what I talk about a lot in that first book is that ADHD is indeed a brain condition. It isn't just some sort of psychological thing or a bad child that needs to be spanked more often. That's not what it is. It's a condition which research shows is an identifiable neurological state where a region in the brain, or really a collection of zones within the brain we call the executive centers, deep within the frontal cortex of the brain. These areas of the brain are both underdeveloped for the age of the child, smaller than they should be for the age of the child, and they're also very inactive. If you measure the brain waves from this part of the brain, when a child with this condition is awake, that part of the brain will be asleep. When you measure brain waves, when you're awake and alert, they're called beta waves. They're a fast, high voltage type wave. But if you measure the brain waves from here, they're more like theta waves, which is a type of brain wave you produce when you're asleep. So strangely enough, it appears that when people have this condition, their brain is awake generally, but that part of the brain is asleep. What does that mean? It means this. This is the part of the brain that exerts executive control over the rest of the brain. So when you have an impulse to slap your boss in the face and run out the door, this part of the brain comes to life and says, no, don't act on that. Just take a few deep breaths. Give it a little time, it'll be okay. So that part of the brain is there to give us what you might call moral reasoning, something that animals don't have. It also is there to help you do things you probably don't really feel like doing, like sitting and completing an assignment, or listening closely when a lecturer is talking to you about executive centers of the brain. It allows you to really be human. It's the most highly developed, the most sophisticated, and actually the most demanding and sensitive area of the brain, and most easily disrupted by a variety of influences that we'll talk about. Now, this also explains why Ritalin or dexedrine will actually slow a child down with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You see a child that's just bouncing off the walls, they're so hyperactive, you put them on Ritalin or dexedrine, and pretty soon they're able to sit still, pay attention. Some of them, if the dose is too high or they're too sensitive to it, they'll be almost like little zombies. It's remarkable how it can slow them down. Why? Well, and in fact, this is a part of the brain that you'd think it would just come alive even more, right? Well, it does. The thing is, when you give Ritalin or dexedrine, for instance, is what the pilots that shot our Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan were taking when they were flying that jet. They're given dexedrine all the time. They're just pumped with it to keep them awake and flying way into the wee hours of the morning. But anyway, rather than keeping a child awake, it awakens this center of the brain so powerfully, it's sort of like finally you have brakes and a steering wheel, whereas before there's no brakes and steering wheel in your brain. So you can think of it this way: when you take a stimulant like dexedrine or Ritalin and you have attention deficit disorder, even though the gas pedal's down a little bit harder, you finally have some brakes and a steering wheel. And the inhibitory power of that part of the brain overrides the stimulant effect of the drug. Even though your heart is racing a little bit faster, your appetite goes down, you get a little jittery, your blood pressure goes up, and your brain is really awakened. This part of the brain is so powerful. When it finally awakens, it's able to exert executive control over the brain, and the child can sit still and do what they're told and so on. So that's the paradox of stimulant drugs. But my premise has been that if this part of the brain is asleep and not developing properly, why should we not try to focus on the stressful elements that might be impairing that part of the brain, impairing its metabolism, etc., and impairing its development? Why should we not be focusing on trying to find everything that might be coming at that part of the brain from every angle? Because it's just a very sensitive part of the brain. Everyone's probably had times when this part of the brain isn't working very well. You might be a shy person. You don't really say much, you're not that gregarious, but maybe you went to a Christmas party one time and had a couple drinks too many, and you ended up with a lampshade on your head dancing around the table, right? Well, that's because the neurotoxic effects of alcohol affect this part first. You were still breathing, your brainstem was still working, you're still able to basically balance, unlike our premier, but basically you were still, basically there, but this part of the brain was affected so profoundly that you were disinhibited, right? You were doing things that normally you wouldn't do. Maybe you regret it later, because this executive center of the brain is so sensitive. And kids have very sensitive brains, and that's the part that's affected first. And I believe that ADHD is a condition of many causes. There's many different factors. This is a multifactorial condition. And one of them, I believe, that is a very significant phenomena is the fact that our brains of today are being attacked by our environment in many ways. You can say the brain is under siege from neurotoxic exposure, and things that are accumulating in our bodies that are neurotoxic, and children are especially affected. There's things from the home, from the workplace, from schools that are impediments to normal brain function, and they're everywhere. And when these chemicals were introduced, we didn't know that much about them, but now we know that neurotoxic exposure and neurotoxic accumulation may be one of the primary reasons why we're seeing a rise in violent behavior. There's a lot of good research where they go into prisons looking at violent criminals, and they find evidence of high levels of certain neurotoxins like lead or cadmium. These types of things cause effects on the brain which lead to violent behavior or aggression. There's evidence that water supplies throughout our land is often polluted with things that are potentially neurotoxic. Our soils are becoming increasingly polluted. Did you know that when the sewage treatment plant finishes with your sewage, they end up with a substance they used to call sewage sludge? And that was a waste material they had to deposit into toxic waste dumps. But then there were some sneaky little laws passed that allowed the municipal waste treatment plants to sell that sewage sludge. They had to rename it first. They call it biosolids now. And then they were able to sell these biosolids as a recycling product to fertilizer manufacturers, so that over 80% of sewage sludge, or biosolids, is now put back on the soils and used to grow food plants. Did you give permission to your government to pass that law? Probably not. It's a pretty dirty substance, sewage sludge. It's loaded with heavy metals and things that accumulate in our agricultural soils and end up, in many cases, being taken up by food plants. Cadmium and things like that certainly get into the foods. And so our foods are contaminated from the soil, from pesticides and so on, from chemicals we put on the foods, from the processing of the foods. Even our teeth may be a source of neurotoxins. Look up Dr. Fritz Lorscheider at the University of Calgary Medical School. He's one of my esteemed professors. And since the late 1980s, the early 1980s, when I was at medical school, he's been doing research showing that mercury vapor does indeed escape dental amalgams at a level which is quite likely to accumulate in certain susceptible individuals. In this room here, there's at least a 100-fold difference in your ability to excrete mercury if it gets into your body, based on a substance that you may or may not be manufacturing efficiently called metallothionein. It's a protein that is sort of like the vacuum cleaner of the cell. Some people don't make enough of it and may accumulate heavy metals more avidly and end up being affected by them. I'm not saying I know all the answers about this, but I'm saying that we need to be looking, digging, trying to find better answers, and where we can avoid neurotoxic exposure, we should. Even a mother, when she's pregnant, may use the fetus almost as a reservoir for toxins that are stored in her tissues. That's especially true if mother is, say, very sick in her pregnancy, or doesn't gain appropriate amounts of weight, or uses, of course, drugs and alcohol and so on. In terms of neurotoxins, we know that kids are exposed every day to pesticides, heavy metals, PCBs, PBDEs. What's PBDEs? You know what PCBs are, right? Those are chemicals they used to use, for instance, in electrical transformers. They're banned all around the world now because they're persistent organic pollutants. If they get into the soil, the water, or your body, they never break down. They stay around forever. PBDEs are also persistent organic pollutants, and you're breathing them right now because by law, carpets and furniture, anything with plastic fiber, has to be manufactured with PBDs as a fire retardant. And unfortunately, it's something that's now accumulating in people's bodies to high amounts, and nobody knows what we're going to do about it because we need these chemicals. Otherwise, things will just start burning down everywhere. Then there's solvents in our environment, phthalates. Where might you get phthalates from? What happens when your baby is teething and they're really uncomfortable? You usually buy them a chewy teething toy, right? How is that rubber made so soft? They add phthalates to it, which is a known carcinogen and probably a neurotoxin. And Greenpeace made a big stink about this a couple of years ago, how much phthalates are in so many things that we actually put in our bodies. It's amazing. Trans fatty acids are an unnatural form of, it's a byproduct of food processing that occurred when they took liquidy vegetable oils and they began to use a process called hydrogenation, where under heat and pressure they added hydrogen or forced hydrogen into the molecules of fat or oil, and they turned into a thick, solid fat like vegetable oil, shortening. And then McDonald's, instead of saying that we use that nasty lard, they now say we use pure, wonderful vegetable oil shortening, which is loaded with trans fatty acids. And in a study that I did, we found that the majority of children had very high levels of trans fatty acids that had ADHD. Very high levels. On average, kids get 10 to 15 grams of this, and it's completely foreign to human physiology. In essence, it's almost like taking a tablespoon of gasoline and dripping a few drops in every bit of food you eat throughout the day, and you're ingesting that. Your body doesn't know what to do with it. It's a toxin, but it's something you're adding to your food for who knows what reason. But you can find these on the label if you see hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, and avoid that. You won't have to take in any trans fatty acids. And there's rancid fats. Deep fryer fat is something that should not really be allowed to be ingested. If you take deep fryer fat, which is usually fried over and over and over again, you take that fat and you take rat chow and you make, instead of the vegetable oils they normally use, you make it out of deep fryer fat, and you give it to rats. Within 6 to 12 weeks, all the rats will start developing tumors, and within a few months they'll all have extensive metastatic cancers from the rancid fats, the different strange chemicals that are generated from those high heats that are used for deep frying. So commercial deep fried foods, which is, if you look at the children's menu, that's what it all is. It's the chicken fingers and the French fries and all that stuff. That's all stuff that is not good for kids, especially. How about acrylamide? Who's heard about this? There's been a lot of news about this lately. World Health Organization is making a big to-do about this. Nobody knows what to do. It's one of the disasters of human history, probably. It may be one of the most critical things for our human survival, because it means we may not be able to eat French fries anymore. In fact, when you take potato, which is a wonderful vegetable, and you heat it to the temperature in the deep fryer, the starchy material starts to degenerate into something that's kind of a plasticky carcinogen called acrylamides. The same thing as Wonder Bread. If you sort of flash bake bread, 1 million loaves an hour, and you give this beautiful white bread to children for lunch, you're giving them enough acrylamides that it's something like 200 or 300 times of the known safe level of acrylamides that workers who work in industries where there's acrylamide pollution, it's about 200 times greater than what they're allowed to work in. And now we're eating it in our French fries and our Wonder Bread. It's a terrible disaster. How can we possibly do without McDonald's French fries and Wonder Bread? And then genetically modified organisms. I really don't know what to make of this. It's such a diverse phenomena where they're taking and they're splicing in genes that are foreign to that particular food. They're putting a fish gene in a strawberry, or they're putting a gene to generate a certain vitamin in a soybean or something. And there's probably a lot of good that will come out of this, but we're also doing an experiment on the human immune system, because we don't know exactly how the immune system will react to proteins that are modified in such a way. So again, I don't know all the answers to this. I just know that where we can, we should try to avoid neurotoxins. You don't have to be a fanatic about this to make some wise decisions, and doesn't have to impair the quality of your life to avoid this whole list here, basically. And there's going to be more and more research showing how significant this is. The pesticide problem is, I think, one of the biggest problems. Even groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics have started to wake up and recognize this. This is a recent article from Environmental Health Perspectives. That's the most prestigious environmental toxicology journal in the world. It's published by the National Institute of Health. And this is a study entitled Organophosphorus Pesticide Exposure of Urban and Suburban Preschool Children with Organic and Conventional Diets. What they did was they took kids and they fed them either conventional diets, and then they measured their urine to see how much pesticide was coming out, or they fed them organic diets, diets with organic fruits and vegetables. And lo and behold, they found the kids that were eating the conventional diets, they were peeing out something in the order of 20 times more pesticides, organophosphate pesticides, which are known neurotoxins. Now, that didn't surprise me at all, but it's amazing that they're finally starting to wake up and wonder if this might be of concern. Because organophosphate pesticides are actually something that was one of the miraculous discoveries of Nazi Germany. When scientist Gerhard Schrader was looking for pesticides, he found something called tabin. What's tabin? And then later something called sarin. What's sarin? It's a weapon of mass destruction. That's what they're about to nuke Iraq about, probably, is organophosphate nerve gases. And yet we're spraying these on our food crops and feeding them to children. And previous studies in the last few years have shown that children, when they eat an apple, may get as much as 200 times the known safe level of organophosphates in just one apple. And yet we just, from the skin of the apple, yeah, you can skin an apple and get rid of it. You can't skin spinach, so you can only eat organic spinach. But yeah, if you skin an apple or you peel a banana, fortunately there's ways around it. You can get smart about these things and you can kind of work around it without even always going to organic. But in some cases, organic is the only answer. And there's some really good books out there. People that are interested should read Generations at Risk. It's one of the best books on this subject. It describes how human exposure to toxic chemicals can have lifelong and even intergenerational effects on human reproduction and development. What it's suggesting is every time a new generation is born, you start life with a foundation that's a little bit more polluted and a little bit weaker each subsequent generation. That may be why kids are more and more susceptible to different disorders, because you start life as a newborn with more pollution, certainly with a wider variety of pollutants in your body than the previous generation. And this is a really significant issue for our future. There's also evidence in our environment that we need to wake up to. This is a book called A Plague of Frogs. It talks about how frogs are succumbing to a variety of things like parasites, pesticides, UV radiation, global warming, and it's saying how the earth is changing, the frogs are responding. And in fact, when I was a kid, I used to be sort of an amateur herpetologist. In fact, I belonged to the Calgary Herpetological Society. My parents will vouch for it. And I used to gather bugs and worms and lizards. In fact, I proposed to my wife. On my knee with the light of my lizard terrarium in the background in my medical school office in 1981, I think. Yeah, 1981 or 82. Anyway, so I love frogs and salamanders and lizards. I used to think they were wonderful. And then when I had a son who was at the age where I thought he would be interested in this, I decided to take him out frog hunting. And when we came to visit Grandma and Grandpa, I took him to some of the ponds that used to be just loaded with frogs. You could almost walk across the pond on the frogs, and I found no frogs, no salamanders. Places where there wasn't even any development, where I used to go hunting frogs and salamanders, they were gone. And I started to research this, and on Vancouver Island, we actually came across a little frog that looked like this. A little arm bud instead of an arm. And I found when I did my research that all around the world frogs are dying, and where they're not dying, they're showing deformities of their limbs and their reproductive systems. And why? Well, why is this happening? It's now thought that it's a toxic synergy between many, many environmental contaminants at very low concentrations. In fact, a university in Ontario showed a couple of years ago that the concentration of DDT as one of these many things that was responsible for this phenomena was so low that 10 years ago they wouldn't have been able to measure it. It was that low. Minuscule amounts, almost homeopathic quantities of toxins that are now present in so many different varieties throughout the whole world that it's starting to cause an effect on frogs. Now, big deal, who cares about frogs? There's probably not another amateur herpetologist in the whole room, is there? One, good. Then basically, the reason why you worry about frogs if you're not a herpetologist is that frogs are the canaries of the natural world. Just like in the days when miners used to go down into the coal mines and bring a canary and hang it up in good visible sight so that they could look back periodically and check the canary. And if a miner looked back and saw the canary on the bottom of the cage, they would sound an alarm and they would get out of that mine immediately because dangerous hydrogen sulfide gas was probably emanating from the mine. Now, the canary was affected far quicker, but eventually, within probably a few minutes, if they didn't respond, they would die too. And what the biologists are telling us is that the frogs are the canaries of the natural world. And if we're not careful, if we don't start to clean up our own personal environments, we can't change the world necessarily, but we can change the world that we put inside of us. We can change the environment that we expose the internal parts of our body to in a great way. And we need to pay attention to these canaries because they're telling us something. Now, likewise, I believe that children are the canaries of the human world. They are highly susceptible to their environment. When we see 10% of our children suffering from psychiatric disorders and rates of Ritalin prescriptions increasing by 1,000%, and as they're saying more recently that the rates of autism are also increasing by hundreds of percent in the last decade or two, we should pay attention. There's something happening. And I think that we need to realize that children are canaries, and we better wake up and do what we can to make a difference. This is certainly one of the ways you can make a difference. Sometimes I still wonder, is there any way, can anyone escape from the junk food generation? And I was a little skeptical about that. I didn't know if you could actually change people's habits of living. I have been kind of a health food nut for a long time. I told you about my time with Community Natural Foods, and my parents would vouch that I lived on mostly brown rice and sesame butter and raw vegetables for a lot of years, because I was a real health food nut for quite a while. But how can you change the majority of people? Their whole culture is ingrained. Well, I decided to get grant support and took on a project where I wanted to see if we could actually do this. So we did a study where we brought 75 families in from our community who had children in their family with attention deficit disorder. And with the help of a registered dietitian from Washington State, we put together nutrition and cooking classes designed to transform, you can say, the culinary culture of a family in a way that made it so that everybody enjoyed the whole process. And I believe that we were quite successful in that. What we did was we combined knowledge about nutrition and the importance of getting away from junk foods towards a whole food diet with motivational things that they could do to actually change the diet around, replacing snack foods that are junky snack foods with snack foods that are really good for you. And if you don't spend much time at a health food store, you probably don't realize that nowadays there's a replacement for just about everything. So when you're in a pinch and you're having like a taco chip craving, there's actually healthy alternatives to that, or a chocolate bar craving or whatever. And so we help them make snack foods and learn how to find snack foods that were good for them. We put on a potluck dinner before every class, so that the assignment for the next class was to bring just one recipe. And then when they came in, they could try 30 different new recipes that were all legal foods. And out of that, they found things that were their favorites. So by the end of about a 12-week course, people had their own personal recipe book. They had made transformations, and most of the families changed the whole way that they ate, and everybody felt better. Not only did the kids with ADHD often improve, in some cases phenomenally, but also many of the families had parents and other siblings who also noticed significant benefits to their health. And certainly my son was one of those that benefited greatly. That was the point where his whole nature transformed. He started reading for the first time. He went from hardly being able to read at all to within a year, when we did standardized reading testing on him, he was reading close to the university level. And we didn't do any sort of specific reading treatments to him. We just improved his brain physiology through a process that I'll talk about as we go on. So what's wrong about fast food or junk food? When you eat fast food or junk food, you tend to have a food that's excessive in fat, starch, and sugar in the absence of balanced nutrients. In a way, I'm kind of sad that they threw the lawsuit out for McDonald's, even though it was kind of funny that people were suing McDonald's because they were this big around. It is kind of pathetic that happens. But on the other hand, I thought it would have been kind of fun to see it carried forward, because there would have been a lot of interesting facts actually presented. One of which is that I don't think that these businesses really tell you honestly what you're eating when you go there. When they promote the full meal deal, the biggie this and the giant that, but when you actually sit down and calculate the calories, the grams of fat, it's astronomical. Anybody with half a brain, if they knew how much was in a triple burger and double fries and a big drink, would probably think twice. When you look at it, it's 3,000 calories and 300 grams of fat, enough to last you for the next 4 days. There's probably a reason to think about it. And the problem is that you could fill your stomach so full with natural food and not really have overeaten, whereas when you eat a meal from a junk food restaurant, you tend to not really feel that full. I can pack away 4 Big Macs, no problem, and still not really feel hungry or feel full. Whereas if I sat down and ate, whole natural food, I could just be stuffed and probably eat about a quarter or maybe a tenth of the calories. And then we have almost always trans fatty acids in junk food, lipid peroxides, which are toxic byproducts of overheated fat. We have something called advanced glycosylated end products. It's the same thing that happens in a diabetic when their blood sugar is high all the time. sugar molecules in excess start to stick to other molecules. It's sort of like having sugar-coated protein. And that's one of the main reasons why diabetics age quicker. They end up having end organ damage, blindness, kidney disease, vascular disease, and so on. And when you heat foods that are sugary foods or starchy foods too much, or you process them too much, it's actually like damaging the food that goes into your body. It has many of the same effects as diabetics with high blood sugar. If you eat these advanced glycosylated end products, it's almost like eating a little bit of diabetes with every meal. And then I mentioned acrylamines from overheating starchy foods, and preservatives, colors, stabilizers, emulsifiers. Many of these, as long as they're shown to not kill a rat at a reasonable dose, then they get put on the market with very little effort to look at the long-term effects. And you know, there is something that you can say about common sense. And I really believe that there's a strong reason to believe that our brains are really crying for nutrition. It is true that the brain will be preserved by the body under almost any circumstance. The body has incredible numbers, incredible redundant systems for just basically keeping the brain alive under the most adverse states. You go to Africa, you see where the child is dying, they've got kwashiorkor, their belly is swelling, they're just like a little stick, and they're still looking at you and thinking and crying and suffering and feeling. Their brain is basically alive, but if you were to measure their IQ, it's probably about 70 or 50. And they may never recover because of the fact that even though the brain is kept alive under all forms of adversity, it's not able to thrive unless it has a far different circumstance in terms of its nutrition. The brain is actually the most nutritionally demanding organ in the body, both for calories. 1/4 of our calories are consumed by our brain, 1/4 of our oxygen, but also the brain it requires such a vast array of nutrients in ideal amounts to function optimally, that it's different than any other organ in the body. The brain is really crying for good nutrition. And again, some common sense. The brain is 100% nutrition. That's what it's made of. Unless maybe people are ingesting things they shouldn't, smoking things they shouldn't, then it's probably composed of a few other molecules. But for the most part, the brain is composed of nutrition. It's what you ate. And there are brain-critical nutritional factors. If you look at the scientific literature, as I have, I've read thousands of papers that connect nutrition to the brain in some fashion. I know now that there are brain-critical nutritional factors, factors that are required for the optimal performance of the brain. And one of them would be essential fatty acids. These are actually building blocks of a healthy brain. If you go back to that region of the brain called the executive center, and if you look at the nerve endings where all the work is going on, the processing, the nerve ending is a place where neurotransmitters explode out of the nerve ending. These neurotransmitters, these molecules, cross that tiny gap called the synapse, attached to receptors on the other side, which is the next nerve terminal, and they transmit the signal down further. And that's occurring at a phenomenal rate. Nerve cells in the brain are very interconnected. In a sense, they're very social cells. The average brain cell actually has 100,000 connected branches. That's how amazing the brain cells are, and that's how communicative they are, and how interconnected. And all of those transmissions from one brain cell to another occur at this nerve ending. And if you want this area of the brain to work properly, because there's such rapid activity, molecularly speaking, then this membrane, which is made up of fat, membranes and cells are made of fat, this membrane needs to be very, very thin, of very low viscosity, very fluid. What's the most fluid, the lowest viscosity oil in nature that we know of? Omega-3s, yes. Especially one called, what? DHA. Docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, is the lowest viscosity oil, essentially, that we know of in nature. And about 80% of this nerve ending is made of DHA. Now, what happens if you don't have enough DHA? The body will still generally make nerve endings, but it will have to use something else. It doesn't have the building blocks of the brain that it needs, so it uses something that's called an omega-9 oil. Now, omega-9 is more like olive oil, where you put it in the fridge and it actually turns solid. It's a thicker oil. In this part of the brain, you need lots of DHA in order for it to function optimally. You'll still be alive if you don't have enough DHA, but you're not going to ever function optimally. And this part of the brain will not even be able to grow sufficiently because of that lack of DHA. Now, I did a study where we drew blood from children with attention deficit disorder, 75 kids, and we found that over 82% had deficiencies in DHA. And there's been lots of studies that have been done similarly and say the same thing. And more recently, Oxford University actually did a study where they gave kids a supplement containing DHA and a omega-6 oil called GLA to children with learning and behavioral problems, and found in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, the gold standard for studies, that it worked very well. Very well. Well, it wouldn't make sense that it wouldn't work well when you understand what DHA is and what it does. These kids need DHA. There's other brain critical nutritional factors as well. It isn't just essential fatty acids that probably most of you have heard something about. This is a slide of one of the lab tests from one of our study subjects, one of our typical study subjects. And down this column are omega-3 fatty acids, the different type that you'll find in the blood. Down here are the omega-6 fatty acids, the different type that you'll find in the blood. Now what does the brain want? The brain wants DHA. That's the very bottom here. I apologize you can't read this, but I'll explain it to you. If it was in the blue area, that would be normal. But you can see about 80% or more of the kids that we studied had DHA in this zone, in the red zone, very low. Some of them it was almost unmeasurable. But if you go up here to this omega-3, this is called alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, and you get that from flaxseed oil, right? That's the richest source. Hemp oil is probably as rich. You can also find little bits of it in soybean oil and canola oil. That's where most of us get our omega-3 from. Walnuts have it as well. And what we're told by dietitians is that all you need when you are thinking about essential fatty acids is to eat some vegetable oil. You'll get all the omega-3 and the omega-6 you need. But we've found that even though most of the kids had relatively normal levels of the alpha-linolenic acid that you get from vegetable oils, the omega-3 you get from vegetable oils, over 80% have deficiencies in DHA. But what's going wrong? Well, in a normal situation, this omega-3 you get from vegetable oils is easily converted through a few enzyme steps to DHA. But in these kids, there's some reason for them to either be using up more DHA than they should be. Maybe there's a lot of oxidation in the brain, and these are very susceptible to oxidation, these polyunsaturated fats. Or maybe the enzymes aren't working right, or maybe it's a combination of the two. I think it's a combination of the two. They both have insufficient enzyme activity to convert the commonly available omega-3s to DHA, and the brain is on fire in these kids. There's a smoldering fire we call oxidative stress, free radical damage, that's not being properly protected by antioxidant protection. And so these DHA molecules are very susceptible to oxidation. If you, for instance, take fish oil, and it's a very pure fish oil, and you put it on your finger, you won't smell any fish. Leave it 5 minutes, whew, it'll smell like fish, and you can wash it 6 times and it'll still smell like fish. Why? Because DHA is so susceptible to oxidation. When you first put it on your finger and smell it, you don't smell any smell because there's no oxidation. Give it 5 minutes in the oxygen and it's just rank. It's completely rancid from oxidation. Now that's happening in the brain because that's the most oxidizing area in the whole body. 25% of your oxygen is utilized there. You need a tremendous amount of antioxidant protection. And in these kids, their brains are literally, I believe, on fire with oxidative stress. And they're burning up their DHA. Now, on the omega-6 side, we found most of the kids actually had excessive amounts of linoleic acid. That's the kind of omega-6 you get in every vegetable oil, and you're getting it everywhere you turn around. They had, most of these kids, lots of omega-6. But about 1 in 5 had very low levels of one called GLA, down here. GLA, gamma-linolenic acid, is one that you get in only a few foods, like evening primrose oil, borage oil, black currant oil, hemp oil. And it did appear that about a fifth of these kids had deficiencies in this. So overall, my impression was that it's probably not a bad idea to supplement kids with DHA and GLA, because you're likely going to be providing insurance that they're getting enough essential fatty acids. And that is in fact what Oxford University did. They realized, yeah, what they really need is mostly DHA, but some of these kids need GLA, so they gave them a supplement with evening primrose oil and fish oil, tuna oil, which is the richest source of DHA, as long as it's checked for mercury, because it's also potentially a mercury source. But any good DHA should be clear of being free of mercury. This is how it works. The omega-3 from your diet, alpha-linolenic acid, and the omega-6 from your diet, linoleic acid has to be converted by a very sensitive enzyme called delta-6 desaturase into the DHA and the other fatty acids that your brain and your immune system and other parts of your body are looking for. The problem is that this delta-6 desaturase needs certain nutrient cofactors to work properly. It needs certain B vitamins, it needs vitamin C, it needs zinc and magnesium. And in my subsequent work clinically, I find that almost all the children that I examine closely have deficiencies in zinc and many in magnesium. It's hard to measure these. You can probably guess that they're not getting enough fruits and vegetables and whole grain products. Many of them are probably deficient in all of these things. And their delta-6 desaturase may not be working because of that. On the other hand, delta-6 desaturase is also very sensitive to stressful influences from the environment, such as trans fatty acids, surprise, surprise, alcohol, even coffee and cigarettes, stress hormones. Who thinks that children with learning and behavioral problems might have a lot of stress hormones in their blood? They certainly do. That's been shown over and over in research. These poor little kids are, they're like CEOs of Enron. Their stress levels are so high. And they can actually, their poor little adrenal glands can literally burn right out. They can go through all stages of stress that Dr. Sellier talked about, right to the point where they actually have a very minimal rise and fall of cortisol and epinephrine that happens every day. People should have a very high peak of stress hormones at a part of the time in the day, usually early morning, and then it should go way, way down, lower on. And most of these kids with serious ADHD problems that have kind of a blunted diurnal rhythm of stress hormones. It's sort of too high all the time. That's one of the reasons why they don't sleep at night, because their adrenaline levels are way up here where they should be almost nothing. And cortisol. Infection can disrupt this enzyme and keep you from developing or making DHA. And who knows, a child with ADHD that doesn't have a lot of ear infection, colds and other things of the sort. We found in our research that we actually cultured the stool. We found half these kids had intestinal parasites. And heavy metals and other what we call xenobiotics, which are unnatural chemicals. All of these things can inhibit this enzyme so that it doesn't work effectively, and you can end up with DHA deficiency. There's other brain critical nutritional factors as well. Protein is one, and it's especially important that kids get protein for breakfast. Why? Because protein is what you make what from? What's the most important thing you make out of protein when it comes to the brain? Neurotransmitters, right? The neurotransmitters that are deficient in ADHD are primarily dopamine and norepinephrine. Those are made from amino acids, the amino acid phenylalanine and tyrosine, which you get from protein. Serotonin you get from other protein foods, and that's important in depression, of course. There's other neurotransmitters you make from protein as well. Kids need protein to build enough neurotransmitters to supply them for their school day. If they don't get protein for breakfast, if they eat Cap'n Crunch instead, then they're not going to get enough protein. The other thing they need protein for is to help keep their blood sugar from going up and down like a roller coaster. And many of these kids have roller coaster blood sugar problems, and that's again related to their stress hormone level problems as well. If you don't have the ability to secrete rapidly cortisol and epinephrine, these stress hormones, in little bursts when you need it, you can have real serious blood sugar problems, because those are hormones designed to help your body manage its blood sugar. Iron is another thing that's very important. You need iron to make blood cells, of course, but iron is also the spark plug for a very important engine inside the body. It's an enzyme called cytochrome. It's actually a family of enzymes called cytochromes that are inside the thermal electric power stations of every cell called the mitochondria. Mitochondria are inside every cell. That's what is used to bring oxygen and food material together to create energy. And the energy is made inside these little engines, these little enzymes called cytochromes. And the spark plug of that engine is a molecule of iron. It's sitting right in the center of that, and that's where all the activity to make energy is coming from, in that iron-rich enzyme. Now, where would you then have a lot of iron in your body? If you need to have iron to generate energy, where do you think you might have a lot of iron? In those dark-colored regions in the brain called the executive centers. They're dark because of the iron-rich enzymes there. They're highly metabolically active regions of the brain that require lots of iron. It's been shown that if kids who are growing very quickly and have needs for more iron than people that are not growing, if they have a marginal iron deficiency such that they are not even anemic, but their iron, other measurements of iron are low, that will affect their learning and behavior. And if you simply give them an adequate source of iron, their ability to do mathematics and intellectual tasks will improve significantly. So it's especially true in rapidly growing kids, 6 to 12, and also in adolescent girls who are beginning to have menstrual periods and need extra iron for that. So iron is very important. I measure iron, a number of iron tests in every child that I see, and I would say probably 75% of the kids that I work with have marginal iron deficiencies. And no one ever even thought to look for it, even though the scientific literature is full of articles on the importance of iron in the brain. Same with magnesium. It's something that is very important in the function of about 500 enzymes in the body. Magnesium is a critical mineral. You can call it kind of like a resting mineral. When you want to contract a muscle, what happens? A decision is made in the brain to contract your muscle, a nerve impulse goes down, it puts a little zap on the muscle, and that little zap causes calcium to flood into the muscle fibrils, and then you contract your muscle. Then when the muscle relaxes, the calcium is pumped out, and magnesium is continuously pumped in to allow full relaxation. If there isn't enough magnesium inside the muscle cell is always contracted, it's always tense, it's always twitchy and irritable. In fact, if you become magnesium deficient enough, you'll actually start having horrible muscle cramps. You'll end up having a problem that can even lead to seizures. Who's ever heard of a woman in preeclampsia or toxemia? That's a situation where the woman's body becomes so twitchy and irritable. I remember seeing the first time as a medical student a woman in toxemia going up and tapping on her knee like this. Normally you need a hammer to get a reflex. You do this with a preeclamptic woman, it goes like that. And it's quite dramatic. And you can even take her ankle, which is hard to get a reflex from the ankle. You do that and it goes like this. And if you see that, if you have a woman whose blood pressure has risen and there's protein in her urine, she's starting to swell, and you tap her reflex here, patellar reflex with your finger, and it goes doo 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 doo. You better treat her quickly or she's going to have a seizure. What do you use to treat her? Magnesium sulfate. Why? Well, we never thought of why. As a medical student, resident, we just gave magnesium sulfate. It was the drug of choice. Well, it's because they're grossly magnesium deficient. Their intracellular magnesium stores are so low that there's no resting activity anymore. It's all hyperexcitable, and that's true for muscle cells and nerve cells. It's been shown in kids with hyperactivity, if you simply supplement them with magnesium, you slow the whole class down. If they're a class full of kids with hyperactivity, they'll actually cause remarkable improvements just by supplementing magnesium. In kids with ADHD, I find them to be, when they're magnesium deficient, you can come up and say, give them a little squeeze here and they'll squeal. Or give them a little tickle and they'll squeal. They're really twitchy and irritable. And often those kids will respond simply to optimal magnesium levels or intake. That's partly from, again, this stress hormone problem. Every time you release a lot of cortisol or adrenaline, you drive magnesium out of the cell, and it actually gets wasted by the kidneys, and you need more than you are even necessarily taking in. Zinc is another enzyme that's required in over 200, or zinc is another mineral required in over 200 enzymes. It's required for immune system function. It's required to make fatty acids. It's required in the brain. A lot of different uses, and again, I find so many kids have zinc deficiencies, marginal or very significant zinc deficiencies, and deficiencies in B vitamins, deficiencies in phytochemicals. What are phytochemicals? Those are the naturally occurring chemicals in the fruits and vegetables that we're all supposed to eat 5 servings of a day, right? And how many kids eat 5 servings a day of fruits and vegetables? Maybe French fries and ketchup, but not the kinds of phytochemical-rich vegetables we really should be giving our kids in most cases. Kids tend to be deficient in phytochemicals, which you'll never die of a phytochemical deficiency in the sense of bioflavonoids and carotenoids and different things. Those aren't vitamins that you need for life, but they're absolutely essential for optimal human performance in so many different ways. And these kids need to get phytochemical optimization, and that means getting them on fruits and vegetables, in some cases using supplements that are rich in phytochemicals. I love to use antioxidant phytochemicals like grapeseed extract, green tea extract, caffeine and fluoride free, of course, but these are the kinds of things you can quickly go in and take a brain on fire from oxidative stress, and you can calm down that oxidation dramatically. In fact, it was back in Calgary when I was in practice probably 7 or 8 years ago when someone in my practice actually came in and they were holding a prescription for Ritalin they got from a pediatrician. They came in asking my advice, and I said, well, it's in this case, I think probably what you ought to do. I knew this child, and in a way it was kind of a relief at that point to see them do something. But they came back a couple weeks later and they said, we didn't fill the prescription, but someone gave us something called pycnogenol. And it's, I think it's sold by multi-level companies or something, but basically it's very similar to grapeseed extract. It's an antioxidant, and within about 3 days of putting this child just simply on that one thing alone, the child calmed right down, and they were remarkably different. I could see the difference in that child right there then in my office, just from the antioxidant effects of that powerful antioxidant. A brain on fire, the fire's largely been put out. And so many kids are, they go through life marginally dehydrated. They get up, they're dehydrated, they don't drink a glass of water, they don't actually get hydrated before they go to school, they run around, they do all sorts of things. They might take a couple slurps from the drinking fountain. In Nanaimo, I was called to the school closest to my clinic and was asked to give them advice as to what to do because they measured the lead level in the drinking fountains and it was 5 to 10 times higher than was allowed by law. What are we to do? This is an old building, we can't afford to rip out all the pipes. But that's often the only place where kids get water is a couple gulps here and there throughout the day when they should be drinking much, much more. So in my practice, I make sure that parents supervise their kids drinking. When they get up in the morning, they make sure they drink a glass of water first thing. Then they send them to school with some purified water in a little container. That's something that's got to come back empty at the end of the day. Simple, but what a remarkable effect it can have if a child's truly dehydrated. The brain, in a state of 5% dehydration, intellectual performance will go down remarkably. And that's often the way these kids always are. Now, we also studied in our research something that I call the gut-brain connection. And that might sound not very intuitive. We know that there's neurologists and neurosurgeons and there's gastroenterologists, but they don't talk to each other. They don't even have coffee in the same lounge usually. I mean, they're completely different fields of medicine. And yet, I believe that the gut and the brain are intimately connected. This is something that we were able to demonstrate in our research. What we found was there was a disruption in something very important, and that is the leak-proof lining of the gut. Kids, or anyone has a layer of cells, a single cell layer thick. These are cells that are very, very hardworking, active cells. They expend their life every 3 days. They're gone. They are born, they grow, and they die in 3 days. And in that 3 days, they connect to their neighbor and they form a leak-proof lining. It's a sheet of cells that is so thin that if you were just to have that one sheet, you wouldn't even be able to see it was here. It would be completely transparent. That's how thin it is. And yet that's what prevents the outside world, a hostile world that's being digested and fermented and swirled around inside your gut, from entering your bloodstream. That's a very hostile world. If you were to take a sample of material from your small intestine, a liquid goop that's got bacteria and digestive enzymes and all sorts of things, and you were to draw it up in a syringe and then put it into your vein and give you say a 10 cc shot, you'd probably be dead in 5 minutes. It's a pretty nasty world inside the gut, and this is the only thing that protects you from that world. It's this layer of cells called enterocytes, and they're joined around the middle by kind of a Velcro belt we call the tight junction, and that allows the fully digested molecules only. It allows them to be absorbed and nothing else. And there's a massive surface area that allows for that absorption to occur. If you were to flatten out all of these finger-like projections called villi and these little microvilli, the individual cells have little fingers, if you were to flatten it right out with an iron, it would be the surface area of 2 tennis courts. That's how much surface area normally you have for absorption. And it's leak-proof. But what we found was that 3/4 of kids in our study had what we call commonly a leaky gut, or as researchers we call that increased intestinal permeability, meaning that large molecules, and we actually did a test where we gave them a substance that shouldn't actually show up in the urine because it doesn't normally absorb. You measure how much is in the urine and you can tell how much of that leaks through passively a leaky gut. And in fact, about 3/4 of these kids had a leaky gut, meaning there's various stresses on these little intestinal cells that are preventing their optimal growth. It's causing them to go under stress. It's causing these little Velcro belts to break apart and gaps to open up between the cells. So this is kind of what it looks like. You have, in the normal situation, you have these large molecules that are flowing around inside the intestine, past these intestinal cells. None of them get absorbed until they're fully broken down into these molecules. This might be an amino acid or a monosaccharide, a simple sugar, or a fatty acid, and it's getting absorbed through the intestinal cells once it's fully absorbed. And none of these large bacteria or yeast or say undigested protein ever gets absorbed. Now what happens in the kids that we studied is this, that you have these gaps forming, and now large molecules and even microbial debris or even living microbes pass right through the intestinal cells.
The child has had history of constipation, stretched bowel. Could this happen?
The child has constipation and a stretched bowel. Could this happen? I think even more likely. In our study, we excluded initially, as part of the criteria to enter our study, we excluded all children with any gastrointestinal symptoms or gastrointestinal diseases. So if they had had some sort of colonic problem or serious gastrointestinal problem, they couldn't even participate. So we had kids that virtually had no intestinal symptoms in our study, and yet 75% had a leaky gut. And half of them had intestinal parasites. And all sorts of other interesting gastrointestinal phenomena were going on in these kids. This is just one of the lab tests that we did showing it's called a lactulose mannitol test. It's one of the many different methods of assessing permeability of the small intestine. So leaky gut syndrome, a common name for this, can result in probably all sorts of problems. Food hypersensitivity, certainly. Not true food allergies as such, probably, but other adverse reactions to foods that happen to many, many more kids than would happen in terms of just food allergies, where you get hives and so on. Environmental intolerances, fatigue and lethargy. People with leaky gut usually feel fatigued. I have studied a lot of people with chronic fatigue syndrome doing the same test and often find a leaky gut in those people. And if you can correct that leaky gut, you often find their symptoms improve dramatically. Sleep disturbances, hyperactivity, irritability, inattentiveness, poor concentration, memory problems, mood swings, muscle or joint pain are all probably symptoms that may reflect leaky gut. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have any of these you necessarily have a leaky gut, but if you have a leaky gut, you don't feel well, for sure. And these kids probably go through their life never feeling well. They maybe don't know what feeling well feels like, so they can't even tell you they don't feel well. If you don't feel well from the time you're an infant, how can you say you don't feel well? You just aren't well. And we did studies in these same kids where we drew blood and looked for antibodies against common foodstuffs. We didn't find evidence in the blood of food allergies in many of these kids. That is, most of these kids didn't get hives when they ate a peanut or that sort of thing. There was a few, but not really any higher than in the general population. But what we did find is extremely high levels of other types of antibodies towards foods that were common foods in the diet, like dairy and wheat and eggs and soy and that sort of thing. So it was really quite remarkable. Then we put these kids on this special diet, including eliminating commonly allergenic or intolerant type foods like dairy and wheat and soy and so on for a period of time. And we found in many cases the impact of that change was dramatic. And we repeated this blood test and found all the antibodies just went away. And the leaky gut in many cases completely went away as well with this special simple diet. And then we were able to add back foods one at a time, making careful observations as to the effects. And in most cases you could identify foods that were problematic foods that kids would have to stay off at least for a while until their gut was fully healed, and then they could maybe go back to eating wheat instead of 6 times a day, maybe 3 times a week or 4 times a week in small amounts. Not like food allergies where avoidance is usually permanent. And we found, as I say, about 50% of these kids had intestinal parasites, things like beaver fever. I said beaver fever in Australia, and they just didn't get it at all. So I thought, well, it must be platypus fever, and they didn't get that either. I had to say giardia. This is a photomicrograph showing giardia. Here's your intestine, your small intestine. Remember those tiny little fingers? When you look at it from this view on top, you're flying over the surface, all you see is these little fingers like that. So you just see little round bumps all stuck together, like that. Those are all those little microvilli. Now those are giardia, sort of like cattle out grazing in a field. Now, what is a giardia? It's mostly a mouth. It's an eating machine. Look at that, that's mouth. That's its tail, that's its mouth. And those are its teeth. This thing is designed to eat. Now what does it eat? It eats you. That's what it does. Here's the giardia in cross-section. There's the little microvilli intact, and there's the giardia after it's had its lunch. There's nothing left. If you have a small child and they get giardia, say they're a 4-year-old and they get giardia, you'll be a family doctor. I remember having this happen a few times, and often it's a child in daycare, and you're charting their growth as they come in for their well baby checks, and then from one check to another, all of a sudden it's exactly the same, no growth at all, or even down a bit. First thing I do in every case is get a stool sample, and most of the time giardia, because these things are having lunch, and in a little child especially, they lose their absorptive capacity so profoundly they won't even grow anymore. In an older child, it usually doesn't affect them quite that way, but they may have a bit of a gurgly stomach or stomach pains, or they may have a higher susceptibility to food intolerances or leaky gut or various immune system problems. We don't really know all the effects of it. We just know it's probably not a great thing to have around in large amounts. And we found some of these kids had 5 different species of parasites in one stool sample, things that you would expect to get only if you, say, travel to India or something, not to Nanaimo. And we found over 80% of these kids had evidence of an immune system deficit, a deficiency in secretory IgA. Every day in a normal person, you make about 3 grams of this antibody, this immunoglobulin, which is a huge amount of a molecule, 3 grams a day, massive amount. And in these kids, you can measure it in the stool because it doesn't get digested. We found most of them had extremely low levels of secretory IgA. And only 1 in 400 people inherits a deficiency in this. So what happens here? It's evidence of the various stresses that are occurring in their gut and their immune system, their nutritional status. It's all sort of one thing compounding another. And it leads to a higher risk of intestinal parasites, food allergies, infections like respiratory infections, ear infections, and so on. This is what it looks like. Secretory IgA is 2 antibodies that are glued together by this protein called the J chain, and it's got this molecule wrapped around it called a secretory piece, and that prevents digestion. That's why it goes all the way through to the stool without being digested, even though it's made of protein. Protein digesting enzymes can't touch it, so it circulates around and it attaches to specific bacteria or yeasts or food allergens, and it holds onto them tight until digestion of these things can occur, so they're rendered harmless. And then it falls around, travels around and finds something else to stick to. It's like a police force inside your gut, keeping you protected from that hostile world. There's all kinds of reasons why immune system impairment, which we found in these kids, could occur. Toxic stress, we talked a lot about that. Antigenic stress. Antigens are partially digested food molecules, for instance. They're foreign particles that cause the immune system to react. These kids with leaky gut certainly have antigenic stress. Psychological stress. When you're a child with learning and behavioral problems, you have psychological stress for sure. Nutritional insufficiencies, maybe even electromagnetic stress, physical stress, infectious stress like giardia, like ear infections, and so on, like a loss of normal gut flora from taking antibiotics. These all may be adding up to cause immune system impairment. So the book that I wrote, Is Your Child's Brain Starving? I wrote with Dr. Christine Laurel, who was one of my researchers at my institute. We did a project with University of British Columbia last year, a double-blind study on herbal medicine and ADHD. But she is actually PhD from University of Calgary. We helped to sponsor her PhD. Her thesis was partly based on our patient population, and her degree is in environmental education. She was in the Calgary School Board as a special education teacher and a linguist working with behaviorally and neurologically impaired children, language and so on disorders, and has taught in universities all around the world. And now she works with us in our research with nutrition and ADHD, and she helped me write this book. But this book is really a distillation of all that I've learned through my research and my clinical work through the years into something that is the simplest possible program that I could find. It's like taking you by the hand and walking you through it. And I call it a smart nutrition program. It involves how you break junk food and fast food habits, and it isn't always that easy, but it can be done. One of the principles is you can't deprive, you must replace with healthful snacks. And those are never snacks with altered fats like trans fatty acids or over-processed fats. And they should always be low glycemic index foods. Glycemic index means how rapidly your bloodstream will receive a dose of sugar from the meal that you eat. We think of that as sugar. Table sugar is sugar, but starch is sugar as well. A plate of pasta that big is virtually the same as a plate of table sugar that big. Your body doesn't know any difference because when you eat that starch, that processed, refined carbohydrate, you digest it so fast, it's like giving a big injection of sugar almost immediately. And it's got the same glycemic index basically as sugar. So learning about the glycemic index, which things you can sweeten with that aren't going to raise blood sugar, fructose for instance, is a sugar, and yet it's so much lower in glycemic index than starch that you can't even compare them. The glycemic index of say a plate of pasta is about 60, very high. The glycemic index of fructose, pure fructose, is about maybe 12 to 15, very, very low. Even diabetics can eat fructose. So some of this stuff isn't really common sense. We've sort of oversimplified the sugar idea. It's really all about glycemic index, which means eating whole grains, eating lower amounts of sugars, and if you have to sweeten something, using natural sweeteners like small amounts of fructose and so on. So that you keep kids off the blood sugar roller coaster. Because many of these kids, they take their sugary breakfast, a high glycemic breakfast of some sort of starchy or sugary breakfast, low in protein, and then about 10 or 11 a.m., they're going down the blood sugar roller coaster and they become miserable bears, or they just phase right out. And that's something that's completely avoidable. So the diet is not a fad diet, it's not a kooky diet, it's really based on sound principles that we've improved upon. The food pyramid is the U.S. version of the Canada Food Guide, and so we talk about how you can take that food pyramid and make it actually work, putting it more towards kind of a Mediterranean diet than what the food pyramid is, and focusing on whole grains and fruits and vegetables as the foundation, and then cultured dairy foods or non-dairy sources of calcium, and then protein sources that are wholesome, like free-range meats and poultry, legumes and so on. And then healthy oils should be always in the diet. Things like fish oil supplements, flax oil, things like that. No hydrogenated or deep fried oils. So it's a common sense diet. And then it involves education as to how to supplement with brain critical nutritional factors as simply as possible. When I first started realizing all the different nutrients that were required, I would write out a list of supplements that parents had to get from the health food store, and sometimes it was 6 or 8 bottles of pills. And most people would come back. They'd either not come back to tell me because they were embarrassed, or else they'd come back and say, "I can't give them all these pills. This is crazy." So there had to be a better way. Supplement with brain critical nutritional factors, including essential fatty acids and all those things I talked about. Antioxidant phytochemicals, as I've said, I'm a real believer in the need for antioxidants. I won't really go into detail on these slides, but the two, I think, greatest ways to easily get antioxidant protection in a child is green tea extract, as long as it's decaffeinated and fluoride free, and that's something that isn't always the case, but it is available. Very safe and effective, and even helps to prevent dental caries. And grapeseed extract. I think those are two phenomenal ways to very easily get very high amounts of antioxidant protection into the brain. Protein, it should be hypoallergenic for that child, something that has a very low likelihood of having an adverse response even when they have a leaky gut. Iron, magnesium, zinc, calcium, other trace elements. And as you might imagine, that's difficult to do if you're doing it all in a whole bunch of pills. So the other thing that I like to look at is rehabilitating the gastrointestinal tract, the leaky gut. In the book I go into this in a lot more detail. And PI is the program that I use. You'll never forget that. It's too strange, so you'll remember it. A is abstain from things that are harmful to the gut, like junk foods, and as much as possible antibiotics and other things that harm the gut. Nourish the intestinal tract with nutrients that support and heal the leaky gut and the immune system around the gut. Help support the systems of detoxification, because the gut is the first place detoxification occurs and the liver is the second place. And you've got to support detoxification or those organs become sluggish with toxic stress. And then I always recommend probiotics, friendly bacteria that help to replenish the normal flora of the gut. And then identify things like food allergies or intolerances, intestinal parasites, and then eliminate those things. You can either eliminate the foods from the diet through the process of an elimination diet, or other main means that I discussed in the book. And then with parasites, I usually recommend those be eradicated. Supporting detoxification, milk thistle extract is an excellent thing. It's actually used extensively in Europe for liver protection. It's something that really helps the body detoxify more efficiently. It's an antioxidant that collects or concentrates in the liver and protects the liver, stimulates the flow of bile, which is where the liver gets rid of its poisons and so on. And it helps protect the liver from stress, from being the detoxifying organ. Now, glutamine is another detoxifying nutrient. It's an amino acid. N-acetylcysteine, another detoxifying amino acid. Glycine, a detoxifying amino acid. All important in what the liver does to get rid of toxins. Inorganic sulfate is another nutrient that's used by the liver to get rid of toxins. And then highly absorbent fibers. So when the liver is processing toxins and allowing the bile to flow freely, it ends up in the intestine. A lot of those toxins will just reabsorb and recycle unless you have enough fiber in the diet to absorb or cling to those toxins and sweep them out of the colon like a broom would sweep a dirty floor. So highly absorbent fibers are important. That's why I approached a company, an ethical nutritional company, Natural Factors, to produce a functional food product that's now called Learning Factors. I've never made a penny from it, and I never will. I went to them saying, I wish I had this in my practice because I have to prescribe, as you saw, the list is all those brain-critical nutritional factors, the different fibers, the gut-healing nutrients, the things to support detoxification, on and on and on. It's impossible. So I put together a formula that it was kind of like my dream formula. If I could only have this in something like a smoothie mix that we could use to give kids, say, for breakfast, to give them a high-protein, low-allergy potential breakfast, get them through the morning, and to boost all these brain-critical nutrients to help heal the leaky gut, support the immune system, support detoxification. If we could have it all in one supplement, that would be phenomenal. And fortunately, the president of Natural Factors, it's a company that's been around for about 45 years, he has a son who has a learning disability, and he's been taken out of school because of that. And he had a strong empathy for this problem and said basically that their company is in a position that they could lose money for the rest of history on this particular focus, and it wouldn't matter. He just wants to give back to the community. And I know they've lost actually millions of dollars on this project that I've come along and done to them. But it's been my dream to be able to get things, not only education, but actually doable programs out there into the community. So I've never taken any royalties off that product or any other of those products, and I don't take royalties from that book. It's something that I'm doing to try to get all of this out there to you folks so that we can see a difference, and then finally maybe various people will start waking up. I know that there are some critical people in Canada and the US paying attention now. I've recently been to the Cleveland Clinic and spoken to physicians there. The head of pediatrics is going to be collaborating on research with us. We've been recently speaking to the University of Toronto. We've got collaboration going on with University of Alberta, UBC. I think that the world is going to change in some way. And in Australia, they've actually passed a law that says that doctors have to look at nutritional programs and behavior modification before they consider prescribing drugs for Ritalin, or they will be audited and they could actually lose their prescribing privileges. And I'm very happy about that because in Australia, I actually spoke to every physician in the country on 2 occasions about this condition and how to treat it naturally, and I think it's finally starting to have an impact somewhere in the world, and I'm looking to see that impact occur elsewhere also. And this, so the learning factors is something that I believe is one of the easy things you can do to accomplish some of the tasks that I'm talking about. It's a quick, easy breakfast or a quick snack food. It's something that if you try a few different recipes, you can usually find something that a child will really enjoy, and it provides many of the goals that I'm looking for. It's to supplement working towards a whole foods-based diet, identifying the foods that are intolerant or allergenic type foods for that child and so on. But in context of a proper program, I've seen remarkable success with this in my practice now, and it's been a wonderful thing to have the nutritional supplementation that easy. And it complements the essential fatty acid blends that are available, like what was used at Oxford. You can't put that into a powder like a smoothie mix because, as I said, as soon as you expose it to the air, it goes rancid and it would taste like rotten fish, and kids wouldn't eat it. So those are kept separately and taken separately. So I'd like to thank Natural Factors for making this possible. They're the ones that sponsored the event, along with Community Natural Foods. I'd like to thank them as well, not only for sponsoring this, but for everything they've done for my life and for your community. They've been a wonderful contribution. Thank you all very much. diagnosis carefully and then prescribe the treatment. And most of the time, the treatment means just a prescription. It isn't any combination of treatments, it's a medication. And that's really what I'm trying to change and try to raise awareness about, is that in fact, there are things that we can find underlying this that are causes of this. We could deal with this from more of a cause-oriented approach without having to jump quickly to using medication. We were told by the Surgeon General a couple of years ago that right now 10% of North American children have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. Now that's as many kids as have left-handedness. That's kids that will, most of them eventually be on a medication and who will probably most likely not grow out of that condition given the approach that's taken to psychiatric disorders. And in fact, as kids get older and they reach adolescence and so on, you'll see more enter this club of psychiatric illness. And attention deficit disorder is certainly one of those. And that's to me a very disturbing fact, because I don't think it was always that way. I don't think that many kids used to have psychiatric disorders, but they do now. And the incidence may be rising quite dramatically. Another disturbing fact, it isn't just children. We know that Alzheimer's disease and other disorders of brain aging, they are scheduled to overtake heart disease as the leading cause of death and disability in this decade. So soon, the idea that heart disease is how most of us will die will be a thing of the past as we start to see more and more people developing neurodegenerative diseases of the aging process as well. And what we're seeing is that we've gone from what we used to call Generation X really to Generation RX in one generation. We're seeing an unprecedented number of kids and adults on neuropsychiatric medications all around the world. I was in Taiwan a couple years ago. As many as 15 to 20% of boys, they estimate in Taipei right now, have attention deficit disorder. Many of them are now on Ritalin. In a country where genetically it doesn't seem like there's such a thing as attention deficit disorder. And then in Australia, I've been there several times talking to physicians about this. And in southern Australia, they told me that there was a 1,000% increase in the prescriptions for Ritalin over the last decade. 1,000%, tenfold increase. Phenomenal. And it's not that it's a new drug, it's been around for 40 years. And we can't just classify this as some sort of fad diagnosis, the diagnosis of, of today and it'll be gone tomorrow. The fact is that prognostically, the future of these kids that get diagnosed with this is not that great. About 50% will end their lives catastrophically or will live their life in despair. And I work a lot with adults. I kind of work at two ends of the spectrum. I work with kids with ADHD, where the parents bring them in and the parents are motivated and the kids are quite malleable and you can work with them. And then I don't often see that many adolescents because they just kind of dig in their heels and say, forget that, I'm not going to do any of this stuff. And then I see them again. Unfortunately, I see people in a residential drug treatment center on Vancouver Island. And in the time that I've been working there, helping out, I would estimate 1 in 3 of those individuals at that drug treatment center, which probably is fairly representative of other drug treatment centers, about 1 in 3, their primary issue, team physicians for 4 years with the Canada bobsleigh team, and didn't really have any thoughts about this condition until my son was diagnosed with this several years ago. And we were faced with a dilemma that probably several of you are facing right now, or maybe have already faced, and that is the school starts sending reports home about your son's behavior, and your son becomes increasingly unhappy, feels like he's not fitting in, the kids don't like him anymore, he's not able to do things in school, he starts saying very negative things about himself, his self-image goes down, 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 and the answer that you're given is to take him to a doctor and get him put on medication. And I was very reluctant to do that, and I decided at that point, I was heading up a research institute on Vancouver Island, I decided to seek grant support to do research looking at the causes of attention deficit disorder beyond what had been looked at up till this point. There's been a almost total focus on the cause in terms of finding a fancy new drug to treat it. What kind of neurotransmitters are responsible for this, and how can we manipulate those with another medication that we can patent for a little bit longer than the medications we have now, or what type of gene is responsible so that somehow we can eventually do some sort of genetic manipulation on this. But the research in terms of environmental factors contributing to this, or God forbid, nutritional factors or gastrointestinal factors have not even been hardly thought of, or had been outrightly dismissed many years ago when maybe some incomplete research had been done and not really shown much success. So I began. There's a lot of things that are very personal to me in this lecture here tonight. Even Community Natural Foods is a pillar of your community. Back 25 years ago, they're having their 25th anniversary, I think. I was a starving university student, and in order so that I could eat good, wholesome food, I put in 10 hours a week at the Natural Foods Co-op on 11th Avenue above the Keg and Cleaver, while Peter and Gary, the two brothers that started Community Natural Foods, drove taxi to pay the overhead for at least 2 years, because it was a vision and a dream they had, and it didn't make any money for a long time. They worked real hard. And a lot of people chipped in to make that a reality. I worked side by side with Terry Willard. You might know Terry. He was a starving university student as well back then. And to see what they're doing now, the thriving business that they have and what they're contributing to the community is a great thing. And my education was in Calgary. My upbringing was in Calgary. My mom and dad are here. And this is really my hometown, so a lot warms my heart about being here. And even this room, I used to come to a computer nerd club here called the Amiga Users Group of Calgary. There was more pocket protectors per seat than any other single place on the planet, I think, here. Band-Aids holding glasses together. But nevertheless, the other thing that is very close to my heart is this topic, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's not really the area that I first began to pursue as a medical doctor. I was really in Calgary a sports medicine physician. I was one of your, you could say, a quest to find answers initially for my son, but as I started to see him improve and essentially emerge as a normal boy from a boy we were told had a disability, I started to see the same thing in some of my research participants, and then later in the patients that I began to work with. And over the last few years, it's become a very rewarding thing on a regular basis to have a family come back in with their child after several weeks or months working with them and coming back with glowing reports about the progress that's being made. And most of the time, it does not involve medication. I'm not a fanatic. I don't throw the whole idea of medication out. But I believe that attention deficit disorder should be treated like a lot of other conditions that doctors treat. For instance, if you have high cholesterol, what are doctors supposed to do? We're admonished in every textbook, every authority. We're told that if you diagnose high cholesterol in a patient, you should work with that patient through nutritional counseling and dietary advice and lifestyle counseling for several months, most say 6 months, before you even consider medication. The same with diabetes. When I have an adult onset diabetic come to my office, the goal is to transform the thinking of that individual, to make them realize that there's something over their shoulder here, that if they don't listen to it, they're going to end up in an early grave, or they're going to end up with a leg amputation or blindness. But instead, within a couple of years, most of my diabetic patients aren't diabetic anymore. We can virtually reverse the condition without resorting to medication in most cases. And that's really not that revolutionary an idea. If you look at the scientific literature, that's considered normal. But with attention deficit disorder, the focus is make the diagnosis.